Alright, so I kinda hate Kron Gracie. And when I say that I kinda hate him, what I really mean is that I utterly despise the way that this guy fights, and I really wouldn't be all that upset if he gets cut from the UFC after his fight against Bryce Mitchell at UFC 310. Where do I even start with Kron? Well, first and foremost, he's a Gracie that grew up watching the Gracie era guys compete in the UFC and Pride when they were still relevant competitors. And yeah, let's just say that I feel like Kron has taken a little too much inspiration from the Gracie style of fighting, but I'll get into that later. Let's talk about his fight against Bryce. I honestly don't know why Dana White and the UFC continue to insist on indulging in this little science experiment that is Kron Gracie, because at this point I think it's pretty clear that this guy does not have what it takes to hang with UFC caliber opponents. Right off the bat, Kron's striking is rudimentary at best, but hey, the guy's a Gracie Jiu-Jitsu black belt, so obviously his bread and butter is going to be his grappling. But the real story here is that even when his fights get brought into his domain, the guy has not been able to capitalize on it at all throughout his last few performances. Over the course of 8.5 minutes of time spent on the ground, he was only able to get one legitimate submission attempt at the end of the second round that Bryce ended up slipping out of. I guess he was kind of able to get into another armbar attempt earlier in that round, but it never really felt like Bryce was ever really in danger there. And you might be saying that Bryce is one of the best grapplers in his division, so it's not really all that surprising that he was able to nullify Gracie's jiu-jitsu, which I agree with. But to that point, what about his performances against Charles Jourdain or Cub Swanson? In both of those fights, Kron's grappling was a non-factor there as well. And given Mitchell, Jourdain, and Swanson are all Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts, so I'm absolutely not saying that any of these guys are slouches in terms of ground fighting. But when Kron got signed to the UFC, this guy was touted as one of, if not the top prospect to watch because of his submission grappling credentials. The guy's an ADCC World Champion and European Open Champion, along with many other placings at the highest level Jiu-Jitsu tournaments. According to his grappling record on Wikipedia, out of his 29 recorded grappling victories, he won 24 of them by submission. The guy submitted all of his opponents, including Gary Tonin, to win his ADCC world title, for God's sake. This guy's grappling game on paper is very much on the same caliber as Gilbert Burns, Jacare Souza, and Damian Maia, who have all had a long history of success with submitting their opponents throughout their UFC careers. My point here is that when it comes to Kron, despite his long list of jiu-jitsu accolades, it doesn't really seem like he's been able to translate his raw BJJ to MMA. And I understand that prior to his current 3-fight losing streak, he submitted his first 5 opponents, but come on man, 4 of those wins took place in Ryzen. And out of his 4 Ryzen wins, his first 2 opponents don't even have Wikipedia pages, his third opponent walked into the fight with a record of 33 wins and 28 losses, and then his 4th opponent was Tetsuya Kawajiri, who had just been cut from the UFC and who ended his career 2-6 in his final 8 fights. This is no offense to Ryzen as a promotion, because I think that they are a better MMA organization than ONE FC or PFL, but I just find it a little bit hard to be very impressed with this level of competition that he was facing during the first half of his MMA career. And then of course he got signed to the UFC, and in his debut he made easy work out of Alex Caceres, who I actually respect as an athlete, but at the same time, Alex has always been known as a striker, and not only that, he was 14-11 at this point in his career, where 6 of those 11 losses he was submitted in. Look, what I'm trying to say here is that Kron Gracie is a one-trick pony, and honestly, I'm not even fully convinced that the one trick that he does is all that effective against even moderate level of MMA competition. Despite his jiu-jitsu skills obviously being very high level, the guy refuses to attempt or seemingly even learn how to wrestle, and unless his opponents get dragged to the ground through him pulling guard, then he's forced to strike, and the guy also seemingly refuses to improve upon his stand-up. This guy literally has 3 wrinkles to his game: pull guard and go for an armbar, drag his opponents to the ground from back control, and block punches with his face. To his credit though, he is a really durable guy, and his fight against Cub Swanson was a great display of toughness. Which leads me to my next point. I think a big reason why I find Kron so frustrating to watch is because he insists on fighting like it's still the 90s or early 2000s. I understand that he's a Gracie and he grew up idolizing guys like Hoyce and Hickson, and I get that he has a lot of pride in Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and all, but times have changed and the sport has evolved so much further beyond pulling your opponent into guard or butt scooting towards your opponent to lure them into your guard. For all the BJJ bros that are watching this video, don't get me wrong here, there's nothing wrong with Jiu-Jitsu, and to an even greater extent, there's nothing wrong with entering MMA as a specialist. For the vast majority of MMA history up to now, most fighters who enter the UFC tend to have a specialization, whether it be striking, wrestling, or grappling. I mean, I would still consider Alex Pereira a one-trick pony to an extent, and he's making it work for him while fighting at the very top of the sport. But Pereira has shown competence in defending against his deficiencies. We've seen him defend takedowns, fight from the bottom position, and we've seen him be able to get back up to his feet. I'm not going to sit here and say that Alex is world class at anti-wrestling or anything, but he's good enough at it up till now in order to keep his fights where he wants them to be. Kron, on the other hand, cannot strike, and he refuses to learn how to shoot a double leg, and those lack of peripheral skills in relation to his jiu-jitsu base leaves him paddling up shit's creek when fighting real competition. I mean, just take a look at the jiu-jitsu specialists that have come before him. For example, Damian Maia was able to become a very competent MMA wrestler who took down a lot of guys on way to submitting them. Even Maia's striking developed enough to be able to avoid Ben Askren's spinning back fist of doom. And then you have Gilbert Burns, who genuinely became a very well-rounded and capable fighter in almost every facet of the game. And I know that Ryan Hall has become a huge meme ever since his loss to Ilia Topuria, but even Hall developed a bit of a karate-like striking style that helped him set up his Imanari rolls. And even though I definitely think it's ideal to become a threat everywhere like Gilbert Burns did, my point here is that specialists have to evolve the other nuances of their game enough to at least enable their specialty. But when it comes to Kron and for all the Gracie MMA fighters in general, they seem to have this stubborn insistence to prove that their jiu-jitsu and their jiu-jitsu alone is all that's needed to win a fight. And sure, back in the day, it usually was enough to get the job done when fighters weren't nearly as skilled as they are today. But the idea of using the Gracie style of fighting from 2 decades ago and thinking it will still work against modern day competition is pretty insane to me, and dare I say it, a little bit disrespectful. Look, there's nothing wrong with him having pride in a fighting style that his family invented and that helped revolutionize MMA, but at the same time, have some respect for your opponents and have some respect for the sport and revolutionize your own fighting system. Fighters have evolved, and the way that fights play out looks so much different than it did when the Gracies were actively competing, yet Kron's over here fighting like it's UFC 1. Okay, that's not even true, because at least Hoist would shoot for takedowns sometimes. And on the topic of respect, yes, he should show more respect to his opponents and the sport, but he should also show some more respect to himself. Because what man can be happy with latching on to another adult male like he's a fucking koala? Anyways, that's the video for today. Definitely let me know what you think about Kron Gracie. Do you think that he should be cut from the UFC, or do you think that he deserves another chance to show what he can do? As always, if you like the video, then like the video, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so. I appreciate you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.